Marie Antoinette had fulfilled her role as queen consort. She had given birth to the Dauphin of France. But her image in the eyes of the French people was that of indulgence, a mockery in the face of their suffering. Despite playing the role she was given, the French would never accept her, as France was on the brink of one of the most pivotal moments in European history. This is True Crime of the Historical Kind. You're listening to part 2 of the execution of Marie Antoinette, of Cake and Consequence. If you missed part 1, make sure to go back and listen there first. Apart from the negative political symbol that Marie Antoinette would become, she, as a person, was devoted to her children and found genuine comfort in their presence. When she was younger, she may have been seen as vain, but she was, after all, a young girl caught in a court built on performance and endless observations. The Palace of Versailles was full of endless rituals and ceremonies, expensive customs that she didn't even care for so much as before. As much as she loved fashion, she was beginning to lean away from extravagance. As she had children, she'd shift her priorities even further. Being a mother was a role that brought her true joy. She still appeared in court as required, still fulfilled ceremonial duties, but began to spend more and more time at the Petit Trianon, a small royal chateau on the grounds of Versailles. Here, she could have more privacy and less formality. She adjusted court protocol to be less costumed. There was less emphasis on powdered faces and poofed hair and rouge, at least when she could get away with it. She wanted to limit wearing panniers and instead opted for layered muslin dresses that were breathable and easier to move in. She saw a slightly simplified, practical way of life. She actually preferred smaller circles of friends, simpler routines, which in comparison would still not be simple in the eyes of the average person. But the more Marie Antoinette sought privacy, the more others watched to see what she was going to do with it. Her relationships were harshly scrutinized, still being labeled as a sexual deviant with outlandish spending habits in a world that was rapidly changing. After the War of American Independence officially ended in 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States as a sovereign nation. France's longtime foe, Britain, had been officially defeated. The colonies were successful in establishing a republic without a king. In France, the news was met with celebration. After all, France had helped make it happen. French ships, money, and soldiers had helped carry the American cause to victory. The French soldiers that fought alongside American colonists gave the ultimate investment in personal civil liberty, but they didn't have that for themselves. As those same soldiers returned home, and to the families of those who did not return home, the stratified classes felt even more profound. The contradiction of aiding the American Revolution while the French monarchy either refused or failed at reform was so palpable, it was impossible for people to not see how France might just need their own overthrow of government. And there were several factors that pushed that sentiment towards the edge of no return. For one, the French did not have the separation of the Atlantic Ocean between people and government, like Britain and the colonies. Then, France's support in the war put them in even greater financial disaster than they were already in. At the same time, France's population had grown significantly as Europeans became more immune to the plague. This put food production and distribution under deep strain. So, while the country of France was desperate for reform, it was controlled by anti reformers. The question many citizens were asking was no longer, how can we beg for change? It was when the people of France were going to take matters into their own hands. As political tensions grew, Marie Antoinette welcomed another child into the world. In 1785, she gave birth to her second son, Louis Charles. His arrival strengthened the royal line of succession, providing France with an heir and now a spare. At court, the birth was marked with the expected ceremony and formality, though the king and queen did intentionally cut back on the expenses of celebration. A healthy heir meant reassurance for the monarchy's future. right? In dynastic terms, it was a success. Yet, a telling sign the broader climate of France was shifting was that the queen's reputation did not improve with the news of her providing another heir. Instead, rumors spread accusing Marie Antoinette of an affair with her close friend, the Swedish nobleman Axel von Fersen. The Labelles claimed that Louis Charles was born 9 months after von Fersen had returned to court after an absence. And as historians have examined their written letters, it's likely they had at least a deep emotional bond, if not more, but there's no definitive proof that he fathered the child. And there are official records that coincide with the king's conjugal visits with the queen that do line up. To question an heir's paternity was more than just gossip, it was treasonous. By making Marie the target of the accusations, it gave people a way to attack the crown, but not the king himself, or perhaps not France itself. Louis Charles' birth should have symbolized continuity and security, but instead it unleashed even worse vitriol towards Marie Antoinette. By now, she was well aware she was an easy scapegoat. She called the French gossip circuits cruel and childish, but she still did everything she could to support the king in his role. This was a time when it was normal for kings to have mistresses, both official and unofficial. But there's no evidence Louis XVI had any. That could be another reason for the focus on Marie Antoinette, where the previous kings had highly involved mistresses that played political parts and took criticism. In this reign, the only woman visible was Marie. Just like when she was targeted in a scandal known as the affair of the diamond necklace. More than a decade previously, King Louis XV commissioned a necklace with Parisian jewelers as a gift for his mistress, Madame du Barry. The necklace was an incredible display of luxury, as the king had intended it to be. It was made of hundreds of meticulously selected diamonds, arranged to lay across the neck and cascade down the chest with bows in that period specific light blue shade. It took years for the jewelers to find the right diamonds, and construct. It was said to be worth over 1 million livres, which would be many, many millions today. After the king's death, the jewelers went to sell it to his grandson, the new king at the time, Louis XVI, who offered it to his queen, Marie Antoinette. But she refused it. There are mixed explanations as to why. Some say because she was being prudent, stating France needed ships more than this necklace. Others say it was a matter of ego, because it had been originally commissioned for Madame du Barry, who she had banished from court. Perhaps it was a bit of both, but she declined it a second time after the birth of the Dauphin. This left the jewelers scrambling. They attempted to sell it elsewhere without success. They had made this massive investment on the request of the king and were now left holding the bag. Sensing their desperation, in steps Jeanne de Lamotte, a minor noblewoman who was quite skilled in deception. She could be seen as a social climber, but she would now become the center of a scheme. She and other accomplices convinced Cardinal de Rohan, a high ranking churchman eager to regain royal favor, that Marie Antoinette secretly wished to purchase the necklace, but could not do so publicly because of the obvious backlash she would get. Lamotte and her associates forged letters supposedly written by the queen, and even impersonated her by standing in a hooded cloak in a secret meeting to create the illusion that Marie Antoinette herself was behind the request. Believing he was acting on royal instructions, the cardinal arranged the purchase, and the necklace changed hands. But when the jewelers demanded payment, the cardinal, expecting to be the middleman, looked to the monarchy for reimbursement. When Marie Antoinette was told this man was expecting payment on her behalf, she was stunned. She had never asked for the necklace, never wanted it, and had explicitly rejected it in the past. But by then, the damage was already done. News of the queen buying the necklace went public and exploded into a public scandal. The story aligned exactly with what they expected from her, secretly overspending behind the kingdom's back for her own selfish desires. The labels and whispered rumors spread, portraying her as manipulative and morally corrupt, a foreigner using France for her own personal gain. It simply wasn't true. Even with the courts clearing Marie Antoinette of any involvement, the story fit too neatly with what they already believed about the queen, and it stained her reputation even further. There was also criticism of the construction of the Queen's Hamlet, which was a small, carefully designed village built on the grounds of Versailles near the Petit Trianon. The hamlet reflected the growing fascination with nature, simplicity, and rural life. It was like an idealized version of the countryside that also stood in sharp contrast to the real countryside that was seeing failed crops under deep pressure to produce. As the queen seemed to retreat into this escape, the public saw it as yet another example of royal overspending, a queen playing at poverty while ordinary people struggled with real hardships. The image of Marie Antoinette strolling through her fake village became a powerful symbol, reinforcing the growing perception that she was wildly out of touch with the realities of her subjects' lives, which was probably pretty accurate. Construction of the Queen's Hamlet was very expensive, but to run it did cost less than the grand productions of Versailles. Regardless, in the eyes of the public, it was more waste. They labeled her Madame Deficit. Looking at how the public viewed Marie Antoinette, it makes sense how she could later be attributed to that famous quote, "Let them eat cake." The direct translation is "let them eat brioche," meaning that if the people are starving, why don't they just eat cake or expensive bread? It reflects the concept that a royal is so far removed from the realities of the common person, her solutions to suffering is as ridiculous as it is tone deaf. Yet the original quote stemmed from Rousseau's work called Confessions, written when Marie Antoinette was just a child, known as Maria Antonia of Austria. It had nothing to do with her personally. For all the pamphlets and labels that circulated, this statement wasn't being used towards her in real time. It would be applied long after her death. But it was the sentiment of that quote that they attached to her. Even as complicated as her position was, she was also just a person. A person who believed they were doing what they were supposed to do, having the king's children. Which she would be surprised to find she was once again pregnant. She had been experiencing some health complications related to childbirth and was concerned that this was too soon after her last baby for a pregnancy. In the summer of 1786, she gave birth to a daughter named Sophie Hélène Béatrice. The birth followed the familiar patterns of royal ceremony, though they again intentionally limited the grandeur for the sake of not overspending resources. Though she was born with the best care money could buy at the time, this baby girl was delicate from the start. Sophie's health was fragile, a quiet reminder that even the most privileged lives were not immune to heartbreak. At just 11 months old, Sophie died. For the Queen of France, the loss was devastating. By this point, Marie Antoinette's life was marked by contrasts. She was a queen surrounded by wealth, yet increasingly isolated. A woman who had fulfilled her royal duties, yet could not protect her children from death. Meanwhile, the ever growing crisis in France continued. To compound the kingdom's woes, nature itself seemed to turn against them. Drought struck in early 1788, leaving fields and crops stunted. Then, devastating hailstorms ravaged the area. What little survived was hit even harder by the winter that followed, the coldest in decades. Rivers froze, grain shipments were halted, and, of course, bread prices soared. This just added further instability. Finally, reform couldn't be ignored any longer. King Louis XVI relied on his Controller General of Finance, Calonne, to solve the crisis. Calonne proposed sweeping changes, a universal land tax, the end of noble exemptions, a structural reform that would finally spread the financial burden across all three of the estates. On paper, it was a rational solution. In practice, it was political suicide. Rather than presenting the reforms to the broader public, Calonne convened an assembly of notables, gathering high ranking nobles and clergy. He was hoping their approval would legitimize the plan. Instead, they rejected it as they had consistently done when reform challenged their privilege. Meanwhile, the public didn't think any reform was being proposed. The message from the nobles and clergy was unmistakable. They would not give up anything willingly. Calonne was dismissed. His successor, Brienne, attempted to push similar reforms through France's regional parliaments. They resisted as well, passing themselves as defenders of tradition while blocking any measure that threatened aristocratic privilege. The standoff deepened. Brienne ultimately admitted that the system was broken. Facing serious unrest, Louis XVI made a decision that no French king had made in nearly 2 centuries. He announced the convening of the Estates General. When it met in May of 1789, the atmosphere was charged. Delegates from the three estates joined to debate the future of France. But the three-estate system by design was unequal. The first and second estates could always outvote the third estate. Until now. The Third Estate made their historic move. They were empowered by Enlightenment ideas of liberty and equality, fueled by years of desperation. They declared themselves the National Assembly of France, claiming to represent the true will of the nation, and boldly announced that all existing taxes were illegal until reforms were made. Then, just days later, the new National Assembly arrived ready to continue the negotiations, only to find the door locked. Undeterred, they took to a nearby tennis court and swore the famous tennis court oath. They vowed to not disperse until a new constitution was written, no matter the threats. Among the Third Estate's vocal deputies was a young lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, who railed against inequality and privilege in passionate speeches. At this point, he was mostly an obscure figure within the assembly. No one could have guessed just how significant he would eventually become. The king was shaken by these challenges to his authority and sought compromise. But fear was rising from every direction. Rumors began to swirl that the king was planning on using the Swiss guards to force them to disperse. It made the National Assembly realize just how vulnerable they were as they stood up against the First and Second Estates. This created an air of fear and paranoia across every level of society. Inside Versailles, the royal family was experiencing another terrible loss. The eldest son, the Dauphin of France, died at just 7 years old from tuberculosis of the spine. Louis Joseph had been ill for years, experiencing a slow, painful decline that no royal physician could cure. His fragile health had long been a quiet sorrow within the royal family. Needless to say, the death of Marie Antoinette's son was shattering, while also happening in a time when the outside world was growing increasingly hostile. Public anger was rising. Even so, court protocol demanded composure. With Louis Joseph's death, the line of succession passed to her younger son, Louis Charles, who was only 4 years old. There was little mourning from the public for the young Dauphin, which greatly saddened Marie. It was becoming more and more clear it was us versus them, between the public and the monarchy. Behind the scenes, the queen was beginning to think in terms of survival, not reform. She began cautiously communicating with foreign courts and grew suspicious of Necker, the popular finance minister seen as the champion of reform. When the king decided to fire Necker on July 11th, 1789, Marie supported the choice, fearing his populist leanings might undermine the monarchy further and lead to the demise of her family. But the public had an entirely different reaction. News of Necker's dismissal spread like wildfire through Paris, igniting fears that the king was abandoning any hope of real change and preparing to crush the resistance with foreign soldiers. Unrest was breaking out all over the city, and soon a militia was formed. Around 10,000 people surged towards the Hôtel des Invalides, where the city's weapons were stored. By midday, nearly 30,000 firearms had been taken, but what they lacked was gunpowder, and everyone knew where it was kept: the Bastille. The Bastille was an old medieval fortress, long past its military usefulness. Inside, there were only a handful of prisoners being held, but that hardly mattered. What mattered was that for generations, the Bastille had stood as a symbol of royal authority, one where the ancient regime had the power to enact arbitrary imprisonment without explanation. And now it held precious gunpowder. By the thousands, they stormed the Bastille. In the chaos, almost 100 attackers were killed. After hours of siege, the governor and those inside surrendered. Though once the fortress fell, the governor was stabbed to death and his head was placed on a pike and paraded through the crowds. A once impenetrable symbol was overtaken by the people. Years of hunger and frustration found a tangible surface to exercise their rage. People began to pull and dig at the stones. Together, they tore down the Bastille with mostly their bare hands. Stone by stone, citizens dismantled the walls, carting pieces away as souvenirs to sell. The French people had tasted a shift in power. They were armed, emboldened, and willing to die if needs be. And so began the French Revolution. Meanwhile, the king was out hunting, marking in his journal that nothing had happened that day, meaning no kill. By the time word reached Versailles, the atmosphere inside the palace changed immediately. Marie Antoinette was still deep in mourning. Now she found herself confronting a new crisis. The palace that had once felt like a safe haven felt exposed. It would be hard to imagine how far would the people really take this. After the fall of the Bastille, Paris needed stability. The king appointed the Marquis de Lafayette as the commander of the National Guard. He tasked him with keeping order in a city that was unraveling. In an effort of unity, a small symbol began appearing throughout Paris. A tricolor cockade, blue and red for the city of Paris and white for the Bourbon monarchy. It was pinned to hats, coats, and uniforms. With the city in turmoil, the king agreed to reinstate Necker and visited Paris wearing the cockade. It was meant to be seen as reassurance, proof that the monarchy still stood with the people. And yet, symbols can cut both ways. From that moment on, loyalty was no longer assumed. It had to be exclaimed, which will become more pronounced later. It wasn't just Paris that was in turmoil. It was all across the countryside. Rumors of armed bandits, often imaginary, were spreading panic. Nobles were fleeing to Paris, looking for the king's protection. They abandoned their chateaux and land as peasants rose in scattered uprisings known as the Great Fear. Manor houses were being attacked, but the peasants were not typically after noble blood. It was the paper, the contracts, ledgers, and records that had bound them to generations of obligation. Once they found what they were looking for, they would burn the papers in fields and village squares to free themselves, then find themselves occupying the abandoned chateaux. Inside the National Assembly, the kingdom was pressed to make more concessions. Privileges were finally renounced. Nobles were to give up hunting rights, feudal dues, inherited exemptions, clergy surrendered tithes, legal distinctions that had defined French society for centuries were abandoned. By dawn, the assembly had voted to abolish the feudal system itself. The nobles' fate would now be tied to that of the king. If he fell, so did they. Just a few weeks later, the National Assembly adopted a document that was to establish the future of France. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen laid out sweeping principles. It declared that authority resided not in the monarch by divine right, but in the nation itself. For many, the Declaration felt hopeful and transformative, though doubts were always present. For the royal family, it was deeply unsettling. If rights belonged to all citizens, then what remained of a king's authority? if sovereignty came from the people, what role was left for a queen, especially a hated queen? The voices of the people were bursting to be heard. This resulted in the rising popularity of a newspaper run by a man named Jean-Paul Marat. Marat was an interesting character who had a skin condition that meant he was constantly soaking in the bath. That led him from his profession as a doctor to writing from his bathtub. As the revolution came to being, he now had an outlet for his very extreme views. And in times of chaos, people don't always want to hear reason or moderate explanations. They want the dirt, essentially, of what's really going on. Marat's newspaper, The Friend of the People, gave them just that, at least Marat's version of it. He spoke directly to a public already primed for suspicion. He warned constantly of traitors hidden in plain sight in government, in the army, in the streets. Every setback or shortage, every rumor became proof that enemies were everywhere. His writings were radical and confident, as though he alone saw the truth and others should urgently follow. So, when an infantry regiment from Flanders arrived at Versailles, it was Marat that wrote of the subsequent banquet. A banquet on the arrival of a regiment was standard, but in these times of mistrust, paranoia ensued. With good reason. While the rest of France faced hunger, the king and his court feasted. But then rumors began to spread that these soldiers had been positioned as a threat to squash revolutionary progress. Marat called it a gluttonous orgy, writing lurid details of the supposed debauchery taking place, and claiming that the cockade was being trampled. This, of course, added fuel to an already combustible Paris. Just days later, on the 5th of October, the combination of food shortage, rumors of military action against civilians, and the revolutionary urgency led to what is known as the Women's March to Versailles. Within the restless, hungry crowds of Paris, a woman began beating a drum, calling for bread. Other women who were out searching for food for their children started to gather, angry about the current state of the famine. Soon, the group began to grow. They were then joined by the Poissards, who are Parisian market women. They sold fish, produce, and bread. They were known for being boisterous and politically aware, as they were constantly directly affected and economically vulnerable. They could haggle with anyone, protect themselves from thieves, and were physically muscular because of their daily hard labor. Then they were joined by domestic servants, seamstresses, and other women. They mixed with revolutionary agitators, and soon the crowd swelled to an angry mob of 7,000 people, declaring that they were going to march the 12 or so miles from Paris to Versailles. The motives began to blend with this many people, but essentially they were going to demand to speak to the king and force him to return with them to Paris. When Lafayette caught word of what was going on, he was reluctant to lead them there, and he didn't want to leave Paris unprotected. But the reality was that he feared a mutiny amongst the National Guard, and seeing as how a mob was on their way to the king, it would be better if they were escorted. Except by the time his regiment was on the move, the angry mob was already reaching the ill-fortified palace. The very construction of Versailles was as a playground for the Sun King, Louis XIV. It wasn't built like a defensible castle or have any of the medieval protections kings usually relied on. Versailles' protection was its distance, which had been intentional to remove royalty from common people. And that was no longer going to be tolerated. The women and their followers marched for hours in the rain with pikes, knives, clubs, tools of their trade, some muskets, and even a few cannons that had been stolen. Once they reached the gates of Versailles, they were met with the newly stationed Flanders regiment. Still, the women held their pikes in the air, some pierced with loaves symbolically, and chanted for bread and to speak to the king. Marie Antoinette and her family, along with their companions, saw them gathering. They were scared and didn't know what to do with this swarm of people at Versailles. They had always been safe here, with relatively few guards. What would they do if they breached the doors? Marie did not want the king to meet the mob, as she was sure they would kill him. while showing herself might only enrage them further. After all, she was the most hated woman in France. By then, Lafayette had arrived with the guard, and the king met with some of the women. He assured them that he was with Revolutionary Progress and would move the assembly to Paris. Lafayette even convinced Marie Antoinette to give a brief appearance on the balcony. The danger seemed to subside until, in the early morning hours of the next day, chaos erupted. Somehow, a few from the crowd broke into the palace. They surged in, tearing through the corridors, yelling for the queen, reportedly calling for her head. When guards tried to stop them, 2 were stabbed to death and their heads were put on pikes. Hearing the commotion, Marie Antoinette awoke, running barefoot, calling for her children, looking for safety. She narrowly escaped their vengeance by barricading herself in the king's quarters before the intruders burst into her room. When they found she wasn't there, they ripped her bed to shreds. As the day progressed, it was clear there was no choice but for the royal family to comply with their demands. It was like a triumphant parade of Parisians escorting their terrified royals from Versailles to Paris. While the mob rejoiced, the Bourbon family would never return to live at Versailles, and nothing in France would ever be the same. This was True Crime of the Historical Kind. Make sure that you're following and/or liking. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, bye.